Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Nancy Trimble. I'm chair of the Durham Region branch, and we've got a good meeting for you tonight. Okay, let's get this going. There we go. So this is our agenda for the evening. I've got a few announcements, and then just a few slides about Zoom tips on how to ask questions. And then our future speaker, Marc Seguin, will tell us about the Cruise of the Breeze. So that will be really good. So just a few minutes, this is our website, and if you go to it, down towards the bottom of Marc's announcement, there is a link to get to his page where you can purchase his book if you're interested in it after the meeting. And we've got something new to share with you. We've got a new Durham Region cemetery map. It's on Google. And we've marked all the cemeteries that we know of in Durham Region and listed some information about them. And we feel this would be very useful for those of you needing to go to the cemeteries that your ancestors were buried in. Don't forget to go to YouTube after we're finished. If you want to re-watch, just go to YouTube, put in Durham Region branch, click on the one with the tombstone on it, and you'll see our channel, and we'll be able to watch this session again. And don't forget to join us on Facebook, because that's where we announce our meetings and where you can share with other people your Durham Region puzzles and questions about your ancestors. We are located in Oshawa. The church is currently still closed, but if you have a research question, it can be emailed to durhamresearch@ogs.on.ca. And for those of you who are OGS members or Ontario Ancestor members, which is our new branding, don't forget that the OGS AGM is in 2 weeks. It's by Zoom. You should have received an email that looks something like this that has the Zoom link to register. And this has been making quite a bit of stir in the genealogy community. Roots Tech, the big conference down in Salt Lake City that usually takes place in February every year, has taken themselves online for conference coming up February 25th to 27th next year. And it's going to be totally free. Now, I've gone to several of these, and they are absolutely worth your time. And I hope you will sign up, get your name into their database so that you can be told all the breaking news as it happens. Quick Zoom hints. You can click on participants and chat. If you're on a computer, your bar will be at the bottom. If you're on an iPad, you may have to tap somewhere on the screen to have your bar show up, usually at the top. I just noticed that the share screen is not there, so ignore my X. But you can click on participants and chat. And when you click on the chat, a panel will appear where you can post questions. So when you click on the down arrow that says everyone, Several names will come up, including mine and the speakers, but there is one that's called questions, and that's being monitored by Anne, who will narrate those questions back to Mark at the end of his presentation. So at this point, I will hand this over actually to Stacy, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight. If you could unmute Stacy, that would be great. I will stop sharing the screen and Mark can put his up.
I should be unmuted.
You are.
A message came through and I always do what I'm told. So you can hear me just fine?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hello, Mark, and thank you for coming to speak with us. I have this book and I really loved it. But I noticed in the preface some words that might be very familiar to genealogists. Research, archival collection, grave site, clues, journal, museum collections, keepsakes and descendants, and of course history. So I think you might have noticed that Mark has a fascination with history. In fact, he has a degree in history from Western, and at the moment he lives in Prince Edward County on the shores of Weller's Bay. So I guess without further ado, Mark, tell us more about the Cruise of the Breeze.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Or can anybody hear me?
Yes, we
I can
can.
hear you.
Okay, here we go. Well, thanks again. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here tonight to speak about a topic which personally I find quite fascinating. As the title suggests, tonight I'll be talking about a journal. The journal was written by this fellow, Henry Edward Baines. Henry was a British Army officer serving in the Royal Artillery. He was stationed in Toronto in 1863. He was also a yachtsman and an artist and a writer and a poet. Henry wrote this journal, A Month's Leave or The Cruise of the Breeze. The journey that I'll be talking about tonight is not just his cruising adventures around Lake Ontario in 1863. It's also about how and why Henry's beautifully illustrated journal ended up here in Canada after traveling back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Let me start in 1870. At age 22, this young Victorian woman was about to embark on an extraordinary adventure. This is Henry's little sister, Isabel. And Isabel is moving unaccompanied from Britain to Canada. Very sadly, her mother has just passed away and she's taking all of her possessions from her home in the London suburb of Brixton, and she's going to live with her widowed Aunt Catherine in Toronto. Her father, Philip Oddie Edgerton Baines, had died many years earlier when Isabel was only 8 years old. Here's just a tiny portion of the family tree. Here you can see where Isabel and her brother Henry fit in. There was also a middle child, Elizabeth. Now, when Isabel emigrated from Britain, she brought Henry's journal with her, along with some personal mementos and dozens of Henry's beautiful watercolor paintings. So, who was this talented artist and writer, Henry Edward Baines? Well, let me jump back a few decades, back to Britain in 1840. Queen Victoria is on the throne. At 21 years old, she's been queen already for 3 years. And her empire, the British Empire, is rapidly growing. This is largely due to the world's largest navy and the world's most active army. 1840 is the year that Henry Edward Baines was born. He was born in the town of Shrewsbury in Shropshire, England. Shropshire is a small landlocked county on the Welsh border. Henry's father, Egerton Baines, was a surgeon, and he had served for several years in the Indian Army. Henry's mother, Mary Rice, was from a family that included several naval officers and army officers, as well as some prominent artists. She herself was an accomplished watercolorist. At a young age, Henry showed promise as an artist. This self-portrait is attributed to him. His artistic ability was likely encouraged by his mother and her uncle, who was a well-known portrait painter. However, growing up in an upwardly mobile, middle-class English family, Henry would be expected to get an education and then choose an appropriate profession, either as a Church of England minister, like his grandfather, James Johnson Baines, or as a medical professional, like his father, Egerton, or as an officer in the British Army, like many of his relatives. Well, Henry chose to embark on a military career. He was fascinated by the technical aspects of the Army, especially the artillery and the military engineers. As a result, he gained admittance to the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. That's where all officers destined for the Royal Engineers or the Royal Artillery were trained. They were trained on how to build things and how to blow them up. Now, cadets were given basic instruction there, not only in soldiering, but in mathematics, chemistry, and French, as well as surveying, plan drawing, and landscape painting. Henry quickly passed from the theoretical class to the practical class at the academy, and in 1859, he graduated and was granted a commission as a lieutenant in the British Army. He was immediately posted to No. 5 Battery, 10th Garrison Brigade, Royal Regiment of Artillery, which was then stationed on the island of Alderney in the Channel Islands. Now here's a photo of Henry all kitted out in his new uniform with his overcoat, his boots, his sword, all of these purchased, by the way, at his own expense. Now, the island of Alderney, located just off the coast of France, was a special place for Henry. As a child, he had lived there for a number of years with his parents and his two younger sisters, Bessie and Isabel. In fact, Isabel was born there. With more than a dozen forts on the island, like this one, all bristling with artillery, Lieutenant Baines and the gunners under his command were kept busy maintaining the guns and practicing their artillery drills. This is probably around the time that Henry developed an interest in sailing, while stationed eventually at 3 different posts along the British-English Channel over the course of 19 months. He started in Alderney. Later in 1860, he was moved to Guernsey and then across the Channel to Portsmouth. Significantly, it was on Guernsey in 1860 that the Royal Guernsey Yacht Club was officially formed, so we think it was here that Henry Baines had his first taste of yachting. That brings us to 1861, with Lieutenant Baines stationed at Portsmouth. In the far-flung corners of the British Empire, many of Henry's fellow soldiers have been fighting in places like New Zealand and in India and in China. It's been a year and a half since Henry received his officer's commission, and since that time, the 10th Artillery Brigade has been doing nothing but boring peacetime garrison duty around the British Isles. Well, all of that was soon to change. 4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, civil war had broken out in the United States. 11 southern states seceded from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America, and they took up arms against the northern states. It wasn't long before the once friendly relationship between the US and Great Britain quickly turned to animosity over many, many issues that developed during the first few months of the American Civil War. One satirical British newspaper, Punch, expressed the two countries' differing views in this way. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean were filled with speculation about war between the US and Great Britain, and Canada was caught in the middle. One Canadian newspaper, the Toronto Globe, expressed this opinion in November 1861. War between Britain and the United States would be the greatest crime ever committed against Christianity and civilization. It is not to be thought of for a moment. Nobody wants to fight on this frontier, but if both sides go to building forts, enrolling volunteers, and storing up arms, a conviction will gradually arise that they are enemies, and then a small spark may kindle a great flame. The spark that kindled that great flame came on November 7th, 1861, when the US warship San Jacinto fired upon the British Royal Mail steamship Trent in international waters. A detachment of US Marines boarded the Trent and seized 4 Southern agents, including the Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell. The Trent affair outraged the British government and much of the British populace. Never mind that the steamship Trent was carrying Confederate diplomats on board. Never mind that the captain of the USS San Jacinto was not acting on orders from his superiors. Never mind that Britain's Royal Navy had done the exact same thing 50 years earlier, stopping US ships on the high seas. The British government made immediate plans to ship 12,000 troops to its Canadian colony, along with tons of arms, ammunition, and other war materiel. This would be the vanguard of a much larger force that would be needed to wage a war with the United States. Among those soldiers leaving England in December 1861 were 117 officers and men of No. 5 Battery, 10th Brigade, Royal Artillery, including Lieutenant Henry Edward Baines. Baines and his battery boarded the steamship Asia at Liverpool. 9.5 days later, after battling several winter storms, they arrived at Halifax. After another 2 days at sea, traveling to St. John, then a 10-day trek on sleighs across the snowy expanse of New Brunswick, then another 3 days by train, Henry Baines and No. 5 Battery finally arrived in Toronto on March 5th, 1862. So this is how Henry Baines, along with 12,000 other British soldiers, ended up in Canada. This is a bird's eye view of what Toronto would have looked like in the spring of 1862. Well, these British soldiers were expecting a fight, or at least they expected to defend Canada from an American invasion. But there would be no war. By December 31st, 1861, President Lincoln had decided that the US had more urgent matters to focus on, namely the rebellious Confederate states to the south. So he decided to concede to the British demands to release the 4 Confederates that had been seized from the steamship Trent 6 weeks earlier. Nevertheless, the British government decided to proceed with the troop deployment, and the result was that Lieutenant Baines and many of the hundreds of other officers now in Canada had very few military duties to occupy their time. Knowing that peacetime garrison duty in a foreign station could be a very tedious experience, the British Army officers, who were, for the most part, men of substantial means, found lots of leisure pastimes to occupy themselves while in Canada. There were balls and parties and amateur theatricals. There were sporting activities, such as hunting and shooting, cricket and soccer. And in the winter, there were still lots of activities like ice boating, ice skating, and sleigh riding. When not occupied by his infrequent military duties, Henry would visit relatives. Coincidentally, his father's older brother, Thomas Baines, lived in Toronto with his wife and children. Their house was only a short carriage ride from the officers' barracks at the new fort where Henry lived. Before arriving in Toronto, Henry likely had never met his Uncle Thomas. Thomas Baines had lived in Canada for more than 30 years and had come here as a land commissioner in charge of collecting rent on the old Upper Canada clergy reserves. Unfortunately, Thomas and several other land commissioners got in the habit of not remitting the money collected from the land tenants, and eventually many of the agents were charged with embezzling government funds. Thomas was lucky. He was allowed to resign his post after paying the money back. Thomas Baines was married twice, first to Catherine Wilcox, with whom he had 5 children, then to Catherine Banks, with whom he had 6 children. The descendants of some of these children still live in the Toronto area today. But let's get back to Henry. When not performing his military duties or attending social functions in Toronto, Henry was known for pursuing his 2 passions, art and sailing. Henry would sometimes go on long painting excursions. Here are 3 of his watercolors from July 1863. This one shows Tews Falls, which is near Hamilton. Here's a watercolor he did of Port Dalhousie, which is at St. Catharines, at the entrance to the Welland Canal. And here's one of the many paintings he did of Niagara Falls. As for yachting, well, this was a relatively new sport in North America, and it became a popular pastime at many British military garrisons. In Toronto, many members of the garrison, including Henry Baines, joined the local yacht club. In fact, the only organized yacht club on the Great Lakes at the time, the Royal Canadian Yacht Club. Here's one of the first RCYC clubhouses. It's the dilapidated steamer Provincial, seen here stuck in the ice of Toronto Bay. During the summer of 1863, Henry, along with a number of friends from the RCYC, went on a pleasure cruise around Lake Ontario aboard the yacht Breeze. During the cruise, Henry kept a journal which he illustrated in a manuscript that he called A Month's Leave or The Cruise of the Breeze. I've now written a book about Henry Edward Baines based on his manuscript, and it includes all of the journal's original paintings and drawings. Now, for those of you who might be interested in boats, I'll tell you a bit about the Breeze. It was a gaff-rigged topsail cutter. It was designed in Canada, but it was built in Britain. The Breeze had a typical sail plan for this type of boat: mainsail, foresail, it had a topsail, a jib, and a jib topsail. By the measurements of the day, using what was called the Thames rule, she was a 17-ton first-class yacht. And that would have given her about a 40-foot length on deck and a beam of about 10 feet. The crew and passengers on the Breeze that summer consisted of Henry Baines and two fellow artillery officers, Lieutenant Henry Harvey and Assistant Surgeon Samuel Woodfull, as well as a Toronto law student, Fred Duggan. Hired as the pilot, there was a seasoned mariner named Burrell. There were also two other serving officers, Captain Morrison with the military transport and Captain Clarkson of the 30th Regiment. And to complete the complement on board was Captain Clarkson's servant, who would do all the cooking, and a retired Army officer, Captain Hancock. Of course, there was also the yacht's owner and captain, Dr. Edward Mulberry Hodder, Commodore of the RCYC, and he brought along his 11-year-old son, Mello. Not only is Dr. Hodder remembered for being a prominent Toronto surgeon, a founding member of RCYC and the club's Commodore for more than 20 years, but he is also the author of the first cruising guide for the lake, The Harbors and Ports of Lake Ontario, published in 1857. Almost a century before modern cruising guides became available, Dr. Hodder's book was an invaluable reference to all mariners sailing Lake Ontario. And it contained detailed sailing directions as well as plans of all of the major harbors on both sides of the lake. Of the 11 crew and passengers who started the cruise in August 1863, 4 left the ship at Coburg, so only 7 really completed the voyage. Here's Henry's hand-drawn map showing the track of the Breeze and all of the ports and towns that he and his companions visited that August. Henry's observations of the places he visited and the people he met provide us with a fascinating perspective on life in North America in the mid-19th century. So, at 10:15 a.m. on Monday, August 3rd, 1863, the Breeze and her crew set out on their adventure, or in the words of Henry Baines, a summer cruise, a careless sail that gives material for a careless tale. Well, they had every indication of a pleasant overnight sail to their first port of call, Coburg. They had planned their arrival at Coburg just in time for the annual town regatta. En route to Coburg, the Breeze passed by the shores of Durham County, at which time Henry composed this poem. The boat was still, the wind was light, the sky all clear above it, the water calm and gleaming bright, but whiskey would improve it. Just half the sun above the land, a broad red shining band, and all around, red windless heaven, this at 6:45. The red light quickly fades away, and in the west gives place to gray. The night is fine, not wind enough to keep the flapping sails distended, save now and then a transient puff, and so our first day out is ended. The breezers would spend 5 days in and around Coburg, visiting local sites, watching the annual regatta, attending the regatta ball, and commenting on various local characters. Local newspaper reported that the lovers of aquatic sports had a fair field for enjoyment during the 2 days of the regatta. The sport was far superior to anything of the kind we had ever had the pleasure of seeing. By the 9th of August, the breezers were saying goodbye to Coburg, and they were off to Presqu'île. They spent the day at Presqu'île fishing. And then they moved on to Weller's Bay for a visit to Consacon in Prince Edward County. From Weller's Bay, the breeze set sail for Wapoos Island on the east side of Prince Edward County. This was the most perilous portion of their voyage, sailing around the dangerous Prince Edward Peninsula. Today, many sailors cruising the waters of Lake Ontario would never even consider sailing any appreciable distance along Prince Edward County's dangerous southern shore. Instead, they would choose to cruise up to the Murray Canal and use the sheltered waters of the Bay of Quinte to bypass the Prince Edward Peninsula. But in 1863, this was not an option for the breezers. Back in 1796, the government of Upper Canada had set aside a stretch of land between Presqu'île Bay and the Bay of Quinte with the intention of building a canal to connect those two bodies of water. However, it was not until 1890, almost a century later, that the Murray Canal was officially opened. During that century, documentary evidence shows that the loss of at least 17 ships and at least 55 lives can be attributed directly to the fact that the Murray Canal was not in place to allow mariners to avoid the dangerous open lake passage around Prince Edward County. While much of Lake Ontario is quite deep and was easily navigable by sailing ships and steamships in the 19th century, the northeastern quadrant of the lake, that is from Presqu'île Point near Brighton to the entrance of the St. Lawrence River at Kingston, has always presented numerous hazards to mariners. For most of the 19th century, ship captains sailing to Kingston or the Bay of Quinte from the west had no choice but to navigate all the way around Prince Edward County. And since there were no sheltered harbors along its Lake Ontario shore, they were forced to sail much of the distance knowing that there would be no refuge should a storm suddenly develop. The problem is that a number of geographical, geological, hydrographical, and meteorological factors converge in this quadrant of the lake to compound the dangers presented by the protruding Prince Edward Peninsula. And one of those is a line of shoals, reefs, and rocky islands, reaching right across Lake Ontario from Prince Edward County's southeastern point to the shores of New York State. This forms a further series of obstacles to ships sailing to and from Kingston and the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. This line of natural obstacles is known by hydrographers as the Galoo Ridge. This is where the otherwise deep lake suddenly becomes shallower and narrower, thereby magnifying the effects of storms, which resulted in such a large number of ship sinkings and shipwrecks in the 19th century that this area became known as the graveyard of Lake Ontario. It's for that reason that a series of lighthouses was built all the way around the Prince Edward Peninsula. By 1863, there were 5 major lake lights, as well as a number of minor lights located on the Canadian shores of these dangerous waters. These essential aids to navigation helped to reduce loss of life and loss of ships until the Murray Canal opened in 1890. By the beginning of World War I, a total of 45 lighthouses and light towers had been constructed in the eastern Lake Ontario region. Well, for anyone who might be interested in learning more about these amazing lighthouses, you can find much more detail in my book, For Want of a Lighthouse. which is available online. So, the breeze is now leaving Weller's Bay on Tuesday morning, bound for Wapoos Island on the east side of Prince Edward County. That would be a 10-hour sail with a favorable wind. And Henry writes in his journal, "We were fairly in the lake by 10:30, then commenced a long beat of 12 miles dead to windward with a nice little sea running straight before the wind. Our object was to get between the rocky group known as the Scotch Bonnet and Nicholas Island, so that we might bear away around Prince Edward and get into South Bay on its eastern coast by night." It would have been at this time that Henry Baines made this quick sketch of the approach to Scotch Bonnet Island, where a lighthouse had been constructed a few years earlier. By 5 p.m., the breezers were just off of Point Peter, so they were making good time. Henry continues in his journal. Then, all at once, the sky clouded over to the southwest. It soon became evident that a pretty heavy squall was coming up. We took in the jib and double reefed the mainsail. One squall passed astern of us toward the northeast. After a very short consultation, the mainsail was lowered. Then the wind nearly fell calm. Then out of the southwest burst 3 flashes of lightning, flooding the whole sky with intense brilliancy. The squall burst over us, a sudden violent gust of wind, then steady hard blow with thick streaming rain. We drove through the water under our foresail sheeted down close at a grand pace. The first fury of the squall was now spent, but it still blew a gale and the sea grew heavier. All the sky was black, except one very beautiful break to the westward, a clear space amongst the clouds, orange golden over the blue trees of Prince Edward. The sun set and darkness came on apace. We sighted the Duck's Light. Then our course was altered and it became necessary to set the mainsail. We close reefed it. Once or twice big schooners appeared suddenly out of the darkness. One showed no light, but just stood across our bows and vanished to the northward. Wet, tired, and sick, I turned in and slept till 2:30. That gale of August 11th, 1863 was one of the fiercest on the Great Lakes that year. Not only did it blow the breeze past Wapoos Island all the way to Kingston, but it did damage throughout the lakes, including the loss of $1 million worth of wheat being carried aboard several ships bound for Buffalo, New York. The breezers arrived at Kingston just before dawn, where they anchored offshore and had an early morning snack, ham and biscuits and whiskey. Henry sketched this view of Kingston from where the breeze first anchored after the storm. They spent the next 3 days in and around Kingston, sailing, visiting friends, and generally recovering from the storm. On the morning of Saturday, August 15th, the breezers decided that Kingston was played out. The cruise was certainly not over, as there were still many more adventures ahead. From Kingston, the breeze sailed to Wapoos Island, where Henry painted this watercolor of Cape Vesey. And in his journal, Henry describes the scenery and people he encountered during his 3 days exploring parts of Prince Edward County. Over the course of the following 10 days, the breezers would be sailing in American waters. Normally, today, this would be a relatively unremarkable part of any cruise around Lake Ontario. However, in 1863, at this stage of the cruise, there were still 3 officers of Her Britannic Majesty's Army on board the yacht. And those 3 officers had been sent to British North America just 18 months earlier in anticipation of a war with the United States. Well, as we know, the war between Britain and the US did not happen, but diplomatic relations between the 2 countries would remain strained until well after the end of the American Civil War. At that time, August 1863, the United States of America was still in the middle of the fight to remain united. The Confederate Army had early victories at Fort Sumter and at Bull Run in 1861. Those were followed by a number of horrifically bloody battles: Shiloh, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and many others. Just a month earlier, in July 1863, the Confederate Army had pushed as far north as Pennsylvania. Well, the Confederate defeat there at Gettysburg was really the beginning of the end for the Southern rebels, and by the spring of 1865, the Confederates would be defeated and the Civil War would be over. But in August of 1863, Lake Ontario seemed a long way from the Civil War. So the Breeze sailed into her first American port, Sackett's Harbor. Today, this is a lovely little town with beautiful houses, nice restaurants and boutiques, and a good marina. But in 1863, it was very different. It had been a lively market town in upstate New York, but the economic effects of the Civil War stripped the town of most of its men and devastated the whole area commercially. And it really wouldn't be until the 1970s before Sackett's Harbor started to be revitalized. Henry Baines had a very poor first impression of the town, as he records in his journal. We found ourselves anchored nearly in the center of a wretched little harbor, lined with rotten quays and rotting vessels. A fearfully dreary place it seemed to be. In 1863, the only remarkable thing about Sackett's Harbor was this. This is the Big Ship House. The Big Ship House was built as a protective cover for a relic of the War of 1812, the 120-gun battleship USS New Orleans. Well, in spite of his initial comments, Henry did acknowledge the reason for the deserted condition of Sackett's Harbor. The prevailing desolation of the town is attributable to the fact of the county in which it is situated having sent 2,500 men to the war already. Well, part of that number was made up of these fellows: the 35th New York Infantry, the Jefferson County Regiment. And as Henry Baines was writing these words, another 700 men were being recruited for the 20th Regiment, the New York Volunteer Cavalry, which was being raised at Sackett's Harbor. The Breezers wandered over to the regiment's headquarters at Madison Barracks, and the sentry there just gladly let them in to look around. After a day and a half at Sackett's Harbor, the Breezers were happy to leave. Henry expressed this feeling in a poem. At last, O Sacketts, fare you well. At last, we burst the spell that chained us in thy rotting port between thy rotten ship and fort. The pride of thy town is utterly dead. There's nothing to do there but turn into bed. Farewell, Sackett's Harbor, thou art thoroughly played out. The cruise, however, continued on for another 8 days, with the Breezers calling at Oswego, Sodus Point, Charlotte, and Rochester. All the while, Henry recounted more stories in his journal, And there were encounters with American soldiers. They watched minstrel shows. They saw the sights, and Henry painted many, many more watercolors. Now, I don't have time tonight to describe all of Henry's adventures, but they are all contained in my book, along with many more watercolors and pen and ink sketches. On Thursday, August 27th, 1863, after a cruise of 25 days, the Breeze arrived back in Toronto. But this is not the end of the story. In Toronto, Lieutenant Baines and his fellow officers went back to their usual routine of military duties and social outings. Henry remained a member of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club for the rest of his life. In 1865, he was elected as the club's fleet captain, but unfortunately he was unable to take an active role since his battery, number 5 battery, was soon posted to Quebec City. Lieutenant Baines and the other officers and men of number 5 battery boarded the steamer Magnet on the afternoon of May 23rd, 1865. And they began a 3-day journey down Lake Ontario and along the St. Lawrence River to Quebec City. Henry had to say goodbye to family and to many of the friends he had made over the previous 3 years and who he would never see again. As the Magnet passed the shores of Durham County, Henry thought of the time he had sailed earlier into Whitby Harbor aboard the yacht Dart, and he penned this poem. Far back the low smoke trailing lies, back streams the braid white foam, and backward still I strain my eyes towards our 3 years home. No more for me the breeze may blow from sky so clear o'er lake so blue. Perchance I ne'er again shall know a life so calm with friends so true. But still, wherever my fate may lead, by Indian palms or dear home shore, no quiet dreams at even fall. Old forms will rise, old voices call. The past will claim my heart, and the dear old times be mine once more. Quebec, however, would offer Henry the opportunity to continue painting and to refine his art, and he painted more than 50 watercolors depicting scenes in and around Quebec City. Sadly, however, Henry would never see the Indian palms of his poem. He would never see his dear home shore again. He would never see his family again. This is one of the last watercolors that Henry Edward Baines painted before his death in 1866. This depicts a fire that occurred on the evening of May 9th, 1866, not far from the church of Notre-Dame de Jacques-Cartier in the suburb of Saint-Roch, just a kilometer from the Royal Artillery Barracks in Quebec City. Just 5 months later, in the early morning hours of Sunday, October 14th, another fire started in the exact same neighborhood. Soon it was raging out of control through the streets of the crowded working-class suburb where hundreds of wooden shops and houses were huddled closely together along the St. Charles River. The fire brigade had been called out, but they were being overwhelmed by the extent of the fire. At 6 a.m., all of the military units stationed at Quebec were called out to help put out the flames. The barracks of the Royal Artillery's 10th Brigade was closest to the fire, so they were the first on the scene. By then, it was useless trying to douse the flames with an inadequate water supply, so the soldiers set about tearing down wooden buildings and blowing up others to create a fire break in an attempt to starve the fire of fuel. The fire soon approached the General Hospital Convent, where many patients still lay in their beds and where hundreds of terrified residents had sought refuge from the onslaught. Lieutenant Baines and his gunners were hurriedly sent to create a fire break in front of the hospital. They set 2 kegs of gunpowder inside a nearby brick building and laid a long trail of powder as a fuse. Henry ordered his men out while he lit the fuse. Before he could reach shelter behind the hospital walls, the gunpowder exploded, sending him and his sergeant flying 30 feet through the air. The fire was stopped, but Henry was buried in the rubble and severely injured. His men quickly carried him into the hospital, where the nurses, the Sisters of St. Augustine, cared for him. Henry was attended by 3 doctors, and after a few days, although still in critical condition, he was awake, talking, and showing signs of improvement. The General Hospital had been saved, and the fire had finally been put out, but much of the Quebec suburbs of Saint-Roch and Saint-Sauveur were utterly devastated. 6 people had died, and many, including a dozen military men, had been injured. 1,200 buildings had been destroyed, and more than 20,000 people were left homeless. The military set up a temporary tent city west of the burned area, and the mayor of Quebec appealed to the city's bakers to work around the clock to supply bread for the homeless. After 10 days in hospital, Henry Baines was able to sit up in bed, and he received several visitors, including his battery commander, Major Leslie, and Mrs. McCrae, the wife of the brigade commander. Henry wrote a letter to his mother, but the next day, this talented young man was dead. He had contracted tetanus, and he died on October 27th, 1866. Henry Edward Baines was 26 years old. In recognition of the soldiers' heroism and sacrifice, the mayor of Quebec insisted that the garrison commandant agree to give Lieutenant Baines a public funeral with full military honors. On October 31st, 1866, a huge funeral procession wound its way through the narrow streets of Quebec City. Thousands of people lined the route. Church bells tolled for hours. Henry Edward Baines was buried in Quebec's Mount Herman Cemetery, and this monument was erected over his grave. Henry's personal possessions, including his paintings and his journal, were sent back to his mother in England. Many of the artillery officers wrote letters of condolence to Mary Baines and her daughters, who were then living in the London suburb of Brixton. To Mary Baines, the Sisters of St. Augustine, who had nursed Henry in his final days, wrote, "It was beneath our roof that Lieutenant Baines breathed his last sigh. Oh, the pang that went through every heart when the sad news became known. As for the sisterhood of this community, we have more reason than all others to deplore the melancholy fate of your son. Was it not while endeavoring to save our monastery from impending destruction that he incurred the fatal accident? One more object we have to offer, dear madam. It is a lock of your dear son's hair. The locket which it is enclosed contains also his likeness, the best we could procure. We earnestly request you will kindly accept this slight token of our loving and heartfelt sympathy." This locket was one of the possessions that Isabel Baines brought with her when she came to live in Canada in 1870. It was also at that time that Isabel brought with her many of Henry's paintings and his journal. Isabel Baines lived in Toronto with her Aunt Catherine, Thomas Baines' widow. Soon she met a young farmer, Alexander Mitchell, from Arundel in Peel County. They were married in 1876, and on their honeymoon, they visited Quebec City, where they met with the Sisters of St. Augustine and visited Henry's gravesite. Isabel and Alexander had 5 children. The oldest child, Kate, inherited her Uncle Henry's journal and several of his paintings and drawings. Kate married Dr. David Boddington, and it was 2 of their sons, George and Arthur, who donated the journal and many of the paintings to Library and Archives Canada in 1995. Now, I stumbled across the journal in 2013. I was doing research for my book on lighthouses, For Want of a Lighthouse, and I found this funny little 19th century sketch showing the Scotch Bonnet Island Lighthouse off the shore of Prince Edward County. Now, my curiosity led me eventually to find Henry's journal, The Cruise of the Breeze, filled with many of Henry's watercolors and sketches. I knew then that this journal deserved to be brought to the attention of the wider public. So I eventually published an annotated version of it in full color in 2018. Henry's tragic death likely meant that his artworks and his journal were carefully preserved and kept safe by his family. Fortuitously, his sister later came to Canada to live, bringing with her this literary and artistic treasure. Today, it's people like Isabel's great-granddaughter, Barbara Boddington Selkirk, who lives in Grafton, and Thomas Baines' 3rd great-grandson, Robert Baines, who lives in Toronto, as well as other members of the Boddington and Baines families who are keeping alive the memory of Henry Edward Baines. The Cruise of the Breeze is really a treasure trove of many, many Ontario family names, any one of which might provide interesting and fascinating research possibilities. If you'd like to know more about Henry Baines and his journal and see much more of his artwork, my book, The Cruise of the Breeze, is available online, or it can be ordered from your local bookstore. Well, thank you very much. Now we might have time for a few questions.
Well, I do have a question which has been submitted by Glenn McKnight. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Glenn says that his father's relatives who came from Germany served at Gettysburg and one was wounded and received a pension. And he's curious if any Canadians joined the regiment that you showed being set up in that town along the lake there.
Yeah, the 35th New York Infantry and the 20th New York Cavalry were the 2 regiments that I mentioned. I don't know of any Canadians being in the regiment. There were certainly lots of Canadians who went south and joined the Union Army, and there were even a few that went further south and joined the Confederate Army. But as for those 2 regiments, it's I really don't know. The U.S. National Park Service has an extensive database of most of the soldiers that served in most of the regiments on both sides of the Civil War. It's certainly worth looking into. Unfortunately, it usually doesn't say exactly where the enlistees were from. So even though you can get a list of all the personnel in the regiment, it may not tell you whether they're Canadian, whether they're from which county and which state. But that's very interesting that Glenn's relative was at Gettysburg.
Now, Karen Pratula has said that this is the best presentation she's seen at one of these Zoom meetings, and she'd like to thank you.
Well, thanks for your comment, Karen. And I was a little bit leery about doing this presentation because it has so many transitions in it, and doing it on Zoom, I thought, well, maybe it's not going to come across well. So I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as you did, Karen. Thank you.
Now, Bob Bell has said all the paintings, I can't understand what he's saying about the paintings in the book, but he says hardcover versus soft cover. Oh, okay. How is the print quality in terms of seeing the painting?
Yeah, the paintings have actually reproduced really well in the book. Most of the any of the paintings that are in the book, and a few of the others are also available to view online at Library and Archives Canada, as is the original manuscript journal available online at Library and Archives Canada. Just search Henry Baines, and you'll find it. The manuscript is very difficult to read because it's just written with pen on paper, but it is peppered with the original drawings and paintings. And so looking at it on the screen, you'll get a really good idea of what it's like. But the paintings really turned out well in the book, in both hardcover and softcover. It's available.
There are several more public chat comments here thanking you for your interesting presentation, but no more questions that I see. Oh, here's another one. Where would I find out about the family names you showed near the end? She's interested particularly in the name Denne, D-E-N-N-E.
Yeah, he was, Denne in particular was a captain in the Royal Artillery. The National Archives in the UK has most of the service records of officers from about 1850 onward, a few before 1850. So you might be able to find his service record at the National Archives, at the UK National Archives, and those are available online. Some of them you might need you might need a subscription for them. Others you don't. I can never figure out which ones you need a subscription to and which ones you don't. But I would suspect that Denne in particular his service record would be available.
Okay, that's all the questions right now.
Well, I'd like to thank Mark. This is very fascinating and really shed a lot of light on, I had never quite realized that the British really felt that Canada would be invaded during the Civil War. So it was very enlightening for me. And I happen to have a great, great, great uncle who served on the Confederate side, having come down from New Brunswick down and served in the Confederacy. So I would really like to thank Mark for an excellent presentation. And I'll just continue on with a few more slides and tell you about future, some of the future presentations. So I've listed the link here to Marc's sale of The Cruise of the Breeze, but it's good to know it's also available on Amazon and a couple other spots. We will be having Lynn Palermo speaking on habits of a highly organized genealogist in October. That's the first Tuesday of the month. I don't know about you, but clutter just seems to be building. You get it cleaned up and it comes right back. So I hope Lynn has some really good tips for us. I'd like to give you advance notice of our annual general meeting and election of officers. That's on the 3rd of November. And we will be having a speaker. It's not quite pinned down, but we will have a pretty good speaker and a very interesting topic following that meeting. December is going to be a show and tell. And this is your opportunity to, of course, it's going to be by Zoom, so we need some way to show and tell. So you need to send your information or photos or a PowerPoint to me at durhamchair@ogs.on.ca, and we'll get it into slides, and then you'll be able to tell the story while I press the slides at the Zoom meeting. So don't wait, get it all together, because I know it sounds like it's a long ways away, but it's not really. The next OGS webinar is October 1st at 7 p.m. Serge Paquette, I've heard him speak before. He's a very knowledgeable person, and I'm sure it'll be really interesting to see what the Archives of Ontario has for those pre-1869 birth, marriage, and death records. I'd also like to put in a quick note that we could really use a few more helpers in our branch. And I note the cemetery updating. I'd like to say thank you to Shelley Lunny, because she's been working on the McNeil Cemetery near Wick in Brock Township for us. And we have almost finished producing two new updates for that, but we could use a lot more people. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed it as I did. And don't forget to join us October 6th for the habits of a highly organized genealogist. At this point in time, I declare the meeting closed and thank everyone again for coming.
Thanks again, Nancy. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.